So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and once again we return to a map which seems to be in somewhat regular rotation, certainly throughout this version of the game, as we make our return to the CARDOLAN outpost. Though last time we saw this, it wasn't a free-for-all setting. Now we're back in its more natural habitat of being a straight-up siege. And it's a popular map for a few reasons, really, and that's that the defenders have got a little bit more agency with how they choose to approach this one. They can either turn it into a battle centred around the river, or they can go right back to the settlement right from the off and turn it into a pure cityscape siege. There's also some outer areas in the hills where ambushes can also play their part. And just generally, many siege maps do tend to have one very distinct way in which the defenders can play them, but this is not one of those. It does give them a few more options, but the main thing to note about this particular battle is that it's going to be the neutrals on the defence. So this really is the bin, really, of all of the units that get discarded from other factions. So there are some units which used to be in the game which are simply not any longer. This extends all the way actually back to vanilla Third Age, some of the units that were discarded from way back then. But also there are some units which are still shared with certain factions that are in the game now, for example the Black Walls, but we'll get onto them in just a moment. 4 factions of neutrals then, so pretty much the vagabonds of Middle-earth have banded together and will be defending the CARDOLAN outpost today. But we'll go through the attackers first and foremost, more of a uniform style army for them, starting off with Y2K86, who's playing as Umbar. Nice sunset actually that this battle takes place in. Umbar, very well-rounded faction, and they do tend to work quite well in siege battles because they've got some really nice heavy infantry, and the supporting units they have as well do tend to lend themselves to making good in the sort of situations that sieges can throw up, so more constricted fights where damage dealing quickly can really help turn the momentum. Corsair Fencers is an interesting place to put your general because they are a little bit more fragile, and assassin class units are a little bit more difficult to use in this version of the game anyway. Their throwing projectiles don't tend to pack the punch that you would want them to, and in melee, because they tend to be a little bit more lightweight, they do tend to suffer in this kind of matchup. When they can be a little bit more mobile, they are more useful as a unit class generally, and the Corsair Fencers are among the better assassin class units in the game. There's a gap here, which presumably means there are Corsair crossbows and or Castamir's Rangers available, 2 of the more deadly ranged supporting units that Umbar have at their disposal, as well as a couple of units of Corsair Blackguards. Recently we saw the Corsair Blackguards do very well in a siege on the offense as well, where they had to deal with Dol Amroth, not only because of their ranged punch with their armor-piercing javelins, but also in melee they managed to stand up pretty well, and considering the rather hodgepodge nature of the neutrals as a faction, some of the weaker units will struggle even against more medium units like the Corsair Blackguards in melee. Speaking of which, Corsair Infantry, their multifaceted nature will also be more useful against a lightweight faction, or partially lightweight faction like the neutrals anyway, in melee, but mainly they're here as a auxiliary unit overall, both at range and in melee, especially with the armour upgrade. They do tend to come into their own, and if you are looking to save a little bit of money in this kind of situation as Umbar, then really dipping into the Corsair Infantry is something that you will often see done, though maybe not to this extent. Although I think we may be seeing a little bit of weirdness going on here, because all of these Corsair units, it is an entirely Corsair focused army by the looks of things, but the Corsair pikemen, obviously very low end but cheap pikes which can be very useful in sieges, and the Corsair savages here, which are more entry level shock infantry units, which are definitely rather commonplace among the evil factions of Middle-earth, are no longer in the regular game for Umbar, so maybe on all eras they are. And also the Corsair Archers are another unit which haven't been in the game for a while as well. Very low tier archers indeed, but this is a very numbers focused Umbar army, which to this extent you won't see anymore because, like I said, at least 3 of the units that we can see here are no longer in the regular game, or regular rosters that we usually see Umbar partake in. Now then, we move on to Tsunami playing as Erebor. I don't believe Erebor have got any surprises waiting for us in their roster, but we shall see. Ironfoot Warriors with the armour upgrade will add some much needed steel to the front line when you consider the pirate nature that Umbar have decided to go with here, not deciding to bring any of their black Numenorian units. The second time in a row we've seen Umbar do that, but of course no danger that Erebor won't be bringing any heavy infantry units. That is their whole purpose. Ironfoot Axe Throwers as well as crossbows, so these ranged support units which we already mentioned with crossbows and throwing projectiles, especially with axe throwers like this, because of their very high base damage, can make life very difficult for the opposing faction in the siege if you can get into the right position, which is of course a little bit more difficult for the attackers, but should still be more than doable in this kind of situation. More Ironfoot axe throwers. The Ironfoot spears here as well, which come as standard actually with the slightly heavier dwarven armour, which is something to consider, I suppose, when building an Erebor army, though generally speaking it's not going to make too much of a difference. The spears still have their place as a more defensive line building unit, though their damage is still somewhat wanting, especially next to the warriors. But the warriors, of course, with the armour upgrade as well, means that that gap is closed regardless. And then we have the bodyguard tier units. It looks as though Erebor have gone fully in for them, which, considering the very numbers heavy nature of Umbar, I can kind of get behind this. Under normal circumstances I'd call this overindulging from the dwarves, because they have so many options at the high end with the armour piercing dragon slayers, the straight up, more defensively orientated highborns of Erebor, the shock infantry of the Sons of Durin, and then the dual wielders of the Obsidian Guard, as well as the Blacklock Engineers, which are another very expensive unit with their body piercing bolts. But like I said, under normal circumstances I'd call this going a bit too far. You're really taking away from the numbers that you could have, which could be a problem in a 4v4 especially, but based on their allies they may very well get away with it, especially considering the fact that quality could be a real difference maker here. And they've also decided to go for Erebor Legionaries and Axguard of Erebor as well, so not cheap from Erebor this, the polar opposite really to the approach Umbar have taken. Marching alongside them we have Cole playing as Rhun. Cole is a name I've not seen in a long while. That's interesting. Loxai on rim, heavy spears of course, and then just in behind them we've got several units of Flagrim also, so armour piercing combined with that more defensible nature. I don't know how many heavily armoured units the neutrals have to pick from. I mean, we'll see as we get into them, but the Flagrim are well positioned to deal with them should they crop up, as are the Gamprim of course, though they have more of a wide-ranging usefulness anyway because of their phalanx formation, so they can be much more useful in a grindy fight should it come down to that, though we'll have to wait and see. Balkoth Tribesmen, Eastron Crossbows and Dragon's Wrath Crossmen, so they're really putting an emphasis on their armour-piercing support units here, or at least high-damage, closer-range support units here, the attackers, which is not too surprising in a cityscape where long-range skirmishing might be a little bit more tricky for the attackers to engage in. And that is also a tried and tested way that the attackers can win battles, so it makes sense the defenders will try to minimise that. Carmel's chosen as well, the bodyguard tier unit, relatively run-of-the-mill as far as bodyguard tier units go, but still, they will do their best I'm sure. And last but not least we have Numenor, played by her Tumihai, so normally we'd see them share quite a lot in common with Umbar, though not when Umbar have gone entirely Corsair focused. The Balagai units will be the preserve only of Numenor here. Balagai footman, relatively simplistic but dependable. Yeah, it must be an all eras thing for those Umbar Corsair units, because that is also when the Temple units, usually the preserve of only Mordor, also come into play for Numenor, which gives them a huge variety of units at the high end, so normally it's a good thing maybe that we don't see that, but the Temple Guard do offer Numenor some more armour-piercing units at range, and obviously a very strong melee combatant as well. Seafarers of Neen Damos are very, very similar to the Corsair Blackguards. I slightly prefer them. They tend to perform a little better in melee, perhaps because of the slightly higher damage. The Axes often offer this kind of unit, and as they're medium-tier units anyway, extra defence here and there doesn't make a huge deal of difference, at least generally speaking. Numenorian Shield Guard, armour piercing on these spears, obviously very effective. Numenorian cohort as well. Alcarondas Legion, usually this kind of unit we only see in Umbar as well, though here they are decked out in their Numenorian colours. And then just in behind we have yet more high tier units. We have Temple Executioners with the armour upgrade alongside the Pharazim Swordmasters. Two of the strongest units of heavy swordsmen in the game fighting in the same faction under the same general today. A rare thing indeed. And the Alcarondas Legion as well, also brass clad, though they are only a Numenor unit anyway. Now then, let's see what the neutrals have in store, shall we? Starting off with Tommy the Unwise, who's playing as one of the neutral armies, the player who sent me in the battle as well, so big thank you to him. It's going to be a really weird mix of units this, but that's part of what made me want to do this battle as quickly as I could really, albeit from your perspective it is still going to be about a month and a half down the road. Orc fodder, naturally, Mordor unit, still in the game as it is, very, very cheap. Very, very poor individually in melee though, so they're not going to be able to rely on Orc fodder to win them the battle, but certainly to pad out their army in terms of numbers, yes. Another unit that is in the game as it stands as well are the Spears of Emenduir, an entry-level Mirkwood unit of all things. Lighter spears, which spears tend to be better when they're heavier, a little bit slower and plodding, but able to hold a line with more gusto. I think the lighter spears, as much as they do make up for the spear malice a little bit more, they do tend to suffer a little bit in the long run because of that slightly lower survivability they have to work with. Spears of Emenduir once more. Spears of Orthanc are a unit which are technically in the game as well, albeit in the slightly lesser seen, I suppose, Dunland faction because of the weird way that they are in the roster. They will be a more genuine faction in their own right in the upcoming patch, and the Spears of Orthanc are still in the game there, but they are renamed and sort of retooled a little bit. But for now, very heavy crossbows with spears, obviously akin to the sort of thing you'd see in Isengard. Another unit that you still see in the game currently as well are the Warriors of Khazad-dûm, obviously the standard line infantry unit that Khazad-dûm have to roll with. Perfectly serviceable as a line infantry unit. They may suffer a little bit at the hands of their Erebor cousins, given the higher tier nature of Erebor today, and also the Numenorians, of course. Armour piercing always going to be handy against the dwarves from Rhun too. Blackwolds, of course, they are in both Dunland and Rhudaur as factions, Berserker class units. Very good at dealing damage, but of course, as with most Berserkers, they do tend to run out of steam fairly fast into a battle if committed to fights that don't suit them. We have the Riders of Orthanc as well, mounted versions of the crossbows we've already seen. A very, very effective horseback unit, actually. Very damaging at range and also very capable of looking after themselves in melee. The first example of a unit which is not in the game any longer and hasn't been since very early in Reforged, I think. Maybe even as far back as the first versions of it, because the Scouts, of course, were the Mordor entry-level archer from Vanilla for Mordor. So that is going to be interesting to see how they perform, given that their stats almost certainly haven't been updated for a long, long time. We have the Black Riders, the mounted Nazgul, which are a unit which have always been in the game ever since Vanilla as well. But you only really see them brought out for custom scenarios or when the neutrals are on the field, such as they are here. We have the Morroquendi bows of Dorwinion, poison arrows, obviously very high base damage on them as well. More Blackwolds and more Warriors of Khazad-dûm, Morroquendi pikes also. I think this stems from once upon a time the Morroquendi not really being part of a faction as such. We only saw them in bits. And that legacy still lives on here in the Neutrals faction. More Scouts, which are hiding, and back then more Warriors of Khazad-dûm as well. So moving on, what more will we see? We have civilians, which of course are shared. Medex are playing as the neutrals here, I should say, but civilians are shared between many of the standard human factions. Units which we've already seen, really. Well, maybe not the standard Corsairs, but some of the regular Corsair units which have been removed from the game since. We have already seen for Umbar, and here we see Corsair pikemen, we see Corsair archers. Frame rate juddering a little bit at the size of such a large army. We've got some more Corsair savages in there as well, so yeah, pretty much kind of an identical army to the Umbarim that are across the way, only with some added civilians. So that's a weird sort of situation where we're seeing nigh identical armies going up against one another. That's kind of impossible outside of employing the neutrals or in custom scenarios, so one of the first times we'll see such a thing. Then we have T.S. Niehoff, who has got some standard bandits, which of course are shared with the hobbits, and I think that's pretty much it. I think the Shire are the only ones that have them in their roster nowadays, although of course they used to be part of Erebor from way back in the day. More Black Riders, unsurprisingly. They are really strong if you can put them in and amongst other cavalry units, much like the standard Nazgul, and they do have the opportunity to do that with the Bjornings, another unit that they share with the Shire. Just in here we have yet more of the Spears of Orthanc and more of the Blackwolds, so elements of the Dunlander faction. We have another unit of Black Riders here, as well as some more Riders of Orthanc. Is this a 3v4? Maybe it is a 3v4. No, it is a 4v4. We have some more Orc fodder, we have some bandits, more of the Morroquendi, more of the Scouts, more of the Morroquendi bows there as well. And finally we have Hidden, also playing as the neutrals of course, with Warriors of Khazad-dûm, a couple of units of Morroquendi pikes. The rest of his army is over here, looking like more of an elven tint to his army. With Spears of Emenduir, we have in and amongst things bandits, Blackwolds, Morroquendi bows, more Scouts, Spears of Orthanc. So yeah, more or less the same sort of thing. So you can see where the general focuses have been, but some have gone more cavalry heavy. There's some Ents in here as well, Actually, some Drake Broodlings. Didn't know they were in there, lurking among the buildings. But yeah, you can see more monstrous units, some cavalry units. It really is a bit of a mess in terms of what the neutrals are able to field, but that's kind of by design on this occasion because of the way that this battle has been structured. But I will make a cut because in all likelihood there will be a little bit of a lull before either the fight for the river begins or the fight for the settlement begins, but we'll see which it is. The defenders are more the deciders of that than the attackers here. So yeah, I'll make a cut and we'll rejoin when the battle is about to get underway. So I was wondering if this would be a river-focused battle or a city-focused one, and as it turns out it looks like it's going to be both, with two of the neutral armies starting off initially by defending the river and the other two staying back in the city. That's an interesting sort of almost perfect split between the defensive players. I don't know whether that's going to end up working out for them or not, considering how usually splitting your army off into distinct sections tends to work out rather poorly in a siege, though more often than not we see the attackers do that more than the defenders, but we'll see how this goes. Although over here we're going to see pretty much two identical armies go hammer and tongs at one another, because it's going to be both the Corsair focused armies, so seeing who's actually making progress and who isn't is going to be somewhat difficult. But then, you know, this battle was always going to be quite a weird one given the layout of all of the neutral armies. The Corsairs advance towards the other Corsairs. Meanwhile, the army in the north, under the command of Tommy the Unwise, is going to be... I mean, it's got two choke points to look after, though each of them being bridges means that they should be a little bit more... well, a little bit easier to look after in that respect. The officer of the Balagaya footman has elected to move forward far ahead of his unit, and that is going to cost him quite dearly if the Orc fodder manages to catch up to him. There's also Alcarondas Legion over here as well. I mean, the overall quality of the infantry on display from the neutrals here is obviously not the highest, and that may ultimately be what ends up doing them in the end, as there is certainly some elements of quality on the attackers, particularly from Numenor and Erebor. It's the sort of forces which are fairly easily going to be able to deal with stuff like Orc fodder. Even the Amenduir units you can see here are pretty lightweight in the grand scheme of things, as much as their stats are fairly impressive. Very often it's their mass and their longevity that is still called into question. Merc would have got other units that the neutrals would much rather have had, I'm sure. Looks like it's going to be trading back and forth between some of the poison projectiles from the Morroquendi. Interesting to see the Temple Guard already moving forward here. I mean, I suppose there's only so many units that the armor-piercing arrows of the Temple Guard would actually be really useful against. The Morroquendi Pike's probably one of those. Maybe the best of all would be the Black Riders, but it's kind of unlikely that the defenders are going to allow you to have your way with them this early on in the battle. It's going to be sort of the mid-game where, at the earliest, where they would start to come into effect. Scion Rim slowly rolling forwards as well. Meanwhile, over here, a giant blob of Corsairs. I suppose the Corsair Blackguards, at the very least, we know are going to be fighting on the side of the attackers, and the Corsair infantry actually, so it's more a case of anything that does have any level of armour upgrade is going to be on the side of the attackers. Everything else is pretty much going to be on the side of the defenders. Plenty of Corsair Savages moving forward, so that extra armour may not actually be as useful as they would like. Plenty of Corsair Pikemen as well. I think this is probably the closest we've come to a mirror match ever, really. And even then it's very, very limited rosters on behalf of both factions here, given the fact that Y2K has foregone much of the rest of what Umbar has at their disposal. But of course, mirror matches aren't really a thing that you can do in Medieval 2. I don't think even in custom scenarios can you actually do mirror matches in the traditional sense. I think you'd need to make use of the neutrals faction actually and do something similar to this, but adding a bunch of other units into them. So this is probably as close to it as we're ever going to get, not only ever have been able to get. More Corsair Pikemen on the way forward, so this is going to be just a bit of a cluster for a little while, I think. Although, to be fair, only Umbar have decided to move forwards. Whatever happened to Erebor? Have they decided to position themselves behind their allies? Oh no. Pretty much Tsunami's entire army, in fact, is moving across this bridge pretty quickly. And they need to be a little bit careful of doing such things. Stuff like the Spears of Orthanc could do a lot of damage very, very quickly. Scion Rim also on the way forward, though not quite ready to fully commit to that. I mean, going in all in across this bridge is all well and good as long as you can actually cross it before a huge amount of damage is done to you. And unfortunately the dwarves don't seem to be in any enormous hurry to get to the other side here, as they slowly amble their way across. Obsidian Guard are also there. Meanwhile, Alcarondas Legion still content, along with some of the basic Valagai footmen just behind them, to be the only ones that have moved forward so far. But a combination of the pikes and the archers, enough to give the light elven units and the orc fodder the boost they need in order to be actually winning this little individual fight against an upper end unit of line infantry in the Alcarondas Legion. Missiles coming in, and plenty of other Numenorians now crossing the bridge as well. And yeah, there's no real sense in taking the slower approach here. I think while damage can be done to the dwarves as a result of their current focus to try and get across the bridge with their entire army, at the very least you're going to force the defender's hand once you get here, and the lower quality of their army overall should probably be exploitable at that point. Scion Rim, and obviously plenty of mass as well, so a lot of these lighter units, even with pikes on the way forward, they won't last too long as soon as the main dwarven column does arrive. That must be said. It's a lot of missiles that they're taking. The obvious ones are the poison trails on the Morroquendi, but the Spears of Orthanc are going to be the ones that are dealing the most damage here. Those crossbow bolts will be very effective against the dwarves. Well, the main choke point, which probably would have been the better place honestly for the dwarves to try and cross, just because two armies over here, especially given the lack of quality overall that Medexa is going to have to be working with given his Corsair army. Sort of going perfectly one for one in that regard isn't really going to be the sort of things which is giving the attackers any sort of, or is allowing the attackers to take advantage of any sort of numbers or quality edge they may have. In many ways they're actually taking away from their own ability to do that, especially given the close proximity there of that unit of Corsair archers shooting back and forth with the archers just in behind them, and a unit of Corsair fencers already on the way forward as well now. It does look as though Medexa's army is still losing. The only real indication we have for that is his units. It says defeat seems certain. For Y2Ks the balance of forces is evenly matched, so it could be that the little edge in quality that the upgraded Corsair infantry, the Corsair blackguards, and of course the Corsair fencers, the main thing here, Corsair fencers should be very good against their fellow pirates in melee, and several units of them should be enough. So Medexa very much resting upon the Corsair pikemen to try and be the unit which carries him over the line. But little else is going to be happening here. Corsair blackguards, victory seems certain, defeat just a little further up. There are a couple of Corsair fencers from Medexa as well which could be committed, but instead they are lying in ambush for the time being. I think that must be Medexa's general. Like I said, splitting off 2 and 2, it will be having some advantages. Like I think Tommy overall is going to be able to see a fair amount of value received from his army. Maybe Medexa will as well, given the fact that it is only one army that's very similar to his that's going to be testing the lines, but even still, maybe not as much as the ones here in the north, with the projectiles really doing quite a bit of the heavy lifting. Erebor going to be forcing the hand now of the defenders, and given that it is only one army over here, excuse me, I am surprised that it took this long for, well, I mean it's fairly early in proceedings, but still, Numenor also following suit, and with this level of pressure on the defenders, eventually Tommy's army will be bulldozed out of the way. But how much damage can be done in the interim is the important thing. Numenorian cohort forcing their way behind enemy lines. Of course, Morroquendi bows. Slightly heavier elven archers, very capable of defending themselves in melee. A little bit more of an anti-cavalry edge than anything here, and Numenorian cohort should ultimately still be just fine against them, but still, all of these things will add up, and the neutrals need whatever help they can get when it comes to melee quality, you would suggest. So moving forward are the Morroquendi bows. Defeat a distinct possibility. And the scouts also ambling their way forwards now into melee. I can't imagine they're particularly strong, although they will have a stat block from a previous version of the game. It's still hard to believe that the scouts are going to be really up to much in melee against something like the Numenorian cohort, but still, throwing everything in. Something we haven't seen from the neutrals actually are some of the old Misty Mountains units that got removed. The Mountain Uruk archers and pikes used to be something which very much existed. And I know they're in the neutrals faction, so it's a little bit surprising to not see them at all. As for other things from way back in vanilla, I believe the old Iron Guard still exists somewhere as well. One of the old Dwarven units. One of the better Dwarven units from back then as well. Can't really recall anything else from vanilla that may be present. Or maybe the 8th Wodia Horse Guard from Dale. They were kind of a strange unit, which existed in Reforged for a while actually, before ultimately getting removed. This is all speculation at most. You can see there the Black Riders. Once again trying to burrow into this front line. I don't know if that's necessarily the best of ideas with a whole clutch of Gamp Rim at the core of this offensive push. And there you can see the routing is beginning. So the brute force approach from the attackers definitely bearing fruit there. And you'd have to say that the riverside defence probably hasn't worked out in the neutrals' favour here. The scouts still doing their best in melee, but again, this time the spear variant of Numenor's upper end line units going to be enough to mow them down. And further along, Morroquendi bows defeat seems certain, so even the elven elements now struggling, and Numenor ultimately will be pretty pleased with that. There's also some runic units over here, so yeah, definitely that particular element of the fight going pretty heavily in favour of the attackers. The only one maybe not would be the one down here, but Y2K should still be able to defeat Medexa's defenders. Corsair fencers having to deal with some Corsair infantry that ultimately managed to bust their way through the lines, unless I missed something obvious like the Oathbreakers in the initial defensive compositions. I would say that the attackers have well and truly placed themselves in pole position to go on to win this fight. Overall, Corsair pikemen on the way back from Y2K. I mean, this is a huge pile of corpses at this point. Corsair archers still firing down. A few javelins still available to the Corsair blackguards. A few of the dwarven units from Tommy's army up north, which have been dealt with also. Corsair fencers against Corsair fencers. Interestingly, Y2K's general very much at risk here, because the health, well, there we go. The healthier unit of Corsair fencers was actually Medexa's there, so the pirate army, morale definitely going to be called into question for them. Tommy's general also fleeing from the field, though their fate was always likely when this was the structure of the battle that the defenders laid out for the attackers. It's like a red rag to a bull when you commit a smaller amount of units to an initial defence, I think, as defenders, and the attackers, if they know what sort of weakness that represents, should be doing exactly what the attackers ended up doing here, with Erebor, Rhun and Numenor being extremely aggressive across the bridges. And yes, they will have taken damage by crossing the bridges, but nowhere near to the level that would have been necessary to make it not worthwhile. So now they should have the strength to feel fairly confident about advancing through the CARDOLAN outpost itself and overrunning it. There's still plenty of time left in this battle though, and the defenders, of course, with 2 full armies that have yet to see any combat at all, there will be 2 players that have got everything left to give. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that the neutrals can still win this, especially not if I've missed something extremely powerful like the Oathbreakers, but we shall see. Flag Rim. Bow still actually fighting quite well up here on this little hilltop, and that will surely come to an end against Dragon's Wrath Guildsman. The Easterling unit that has really comparable melee defense to some of the best Elven units in the game. As an assassin class unit, they're still a little bit flimsy in terms of their own damage values. Their projectiles are a little bit more difficult to use, but overall they definitely have their upsides. Victory seems certain. Only a fool could lose this battle. Numenorian cohorts running around, trying to clean up everything that remains. There's still some attacking units on the other side of the river, which is a sign of how things have gone. Riders of the Orthanc. Or Riders of Orthanc, I should say. Still very much the sort of unit that could be a bit of a pain here for the attackers. They can find good things to charge into, and the Erebor Legionaries do count as that. They don't really have any anti-cavalry bonuses to speak of. A few more charges, though they are mainly considered melee cavalry and melee, so how effective they can be is going to be somewhat limited. The Black Riders up here as well, so cavalry still a factor over here. There's not much of Y2K's army left really, is there? Victorious though they may have been down here, it was a significantly closer affair than it was on the 2 bridges up north, so Y2K are going to only have a bit part to play really in attempting to take the outpost itself. On the map here there's a few units that are hidden away in the trees. The Bjornings, the Black Riders, now the general in there can hide as well. Dangerous, though not the most numerous units of cavalry, even with the Bjornings, though in the very last battle we showcased, we did see the Bjornings be very, very effective. It wasn't enough for the defenders then, though, and I highly doubt, given the way the initial parts of this battle have gone, that it'll be enough for the defenders here either. Black Riders moving in. Again, the Black Riders individually may be very, very strong, and this really does help them against other cavalry and melee, but the limited numbers does mean that their mass is somewhat lacking, so when being used as shock cavalry with the intent of dealing damage like this, they can do it, but it is far slower paced than it would be for most regular units of cavalry that we see in the game. Though their smaller size does allow them to be a little bit more nimble like that, just about managing to bob and weave through the Easterling forces. There's still some Elven archers over here. Surely they must be broken and fighting to the death. And they actually are not. Defeat seems certain, but they are still eager. Dragon's Wrath Guildsman having to fight uphill. Surely that isn't the big difference maker. And you can see that with a bigger unit of cavalry, that probably would have been far more devastating. This will add up in the long run. The Black Riders being so individually difficult to kill means that wearing them down in melee is a little bit more difficult to do, unless you've got a unit of crossbows or something that can focus them down. It's often not the answer. Like something like that will certainly help. And there you can see one of the examples of an assassin class unit actually doing its job, engaging with a very high tier unit and assassinating a good portion of them. Assassin class unit is one of those things that are allegedly going to get buffed in the next version of the game, and that can only be a good thing for them. Don't know. Shadow Guard. Don't know where the Riders of Orthanc went. Fighting off against something over here. Medexa's got some Corsair pikemen over here. I'm pretty sure they must have returned from routing at some point, surely. There's no way they would be randomly in this section of the map if that was not the case. But I'm sure they will return to routing ways pretty quickly, with or without the assistance of the 4 Black Riders that remain here in the northern part of the map, though there's still those sequestered away in that little forested path to the south of the settlement. And this, interestingly enough, this sort of picking off of all the stragglers that still remain in the north, the cavalry and all these little units of infantry, has taken just about as long as smashing through the main lines across the bridges took. As a little aside, Scion Rim on the way over. Plenty of Erebor units still left. I mean, Erebor and Numenor and Rhun each damaged a little, but nowhere near enough, surely. Interestingly enough, the balance of power is still not massively skewed, so perhaps hope exists yet, if only a fool's hope. What have we got here? 2 of the Black Riders now remain. Wasn't that one Alcarondas Legionnaire that killed off more of them, but more deaths nonetheless. And at this point, I mean, if nothing else, they're pretty much on their lonesome, these 2, delaying the advancing of the main armies. Those units are going to be heading off to the south as well. Interestingly enough, the attackers not really willing to wait for too long. Y2K, despite being the army that took the most amount of damage of the attackers initially, is going to be getting things underway in the settlement right now, at least in all the ways that he can, just by taking a few pot shots in through the front entrance here, doing some damage to the initial front line that Hidden has laid on for the attackers when they eventually get here. I mean, any kills that they can somehow score on the Morroquendi pikes would definitely be worth it. And the Corsair fencers will probably be more likely to score kills as well. I mean, these are all extremely depleted units, and yet they will still have sufficient ammunition to do a lot of damage if they are allowed to. If this is allowed to remain the case, then it will almost certainly not end well for them. I wonder how much ammo they really have. A few more units left as well. Slowly but surely, that is Tommy's. I was going to go back over here and see if the Black Riders were still doing their thing, but with that announcement, I think that is confirmation that they perished. And surely now the advance can resume. The Easterlings actually going to be the ones bringing up the rear by the looks of things, with Erebor moving forwards. Numenor actually having made the most progress, paying the least heed to the cavalry that was buzzing about them a little earlier on. There's still stuff like the Pharazim Swordmass as well, so yeah, it's really all for the defenders to do. And the extremely unorthodox nature of their setup and their armies here so far has not really paid dividends. But maybe it can. So stuff like the Drake Broodlings could be quite an interesting unit to see in the late game. And stuff like this as well, just adding to the defenders' eventual woes, surely. I mean, to be fair, not really a huge amount of kills. This surely will now be enough to lay them low. This may be enough actually to bring about the end to this entire skirmishing party that Y2K has sent forward to try and antagonise the defenders. But yeah, the Morroquendi Pike's actually getting pushed forward by the Drake Broodlings. They're a very weird unit, the Drake Broodlings, overall. If you keep them moving, they can actually be brutally effective. You can see that they do have invisible riders because they are counted as cavalry, which is why when we have a sunset battle like this, there are floating torches above them. From a distance, it makes them kind of look like some sort of weird land-based anglerfish, but routing induced, and yeah, they can be quite a scary unit to face down. Probably has the biggest range of effectiveness between being utterly useless and being supremely effective, the Drake Broodlings, depending on the situation, the map, how the player elects to use them, and saving the rest of them for later. I mean, it's very possible that a unit of over 90 Corsair infantry will return from routing, but at the very least, the Corsair army is now fully aware of the fact that they won't be able to get away too easily. We're doing that kind of skirmishing again. Corsair pikes, of course, will be very good against the Drake Broodlings because of their cavalry-based nature. Some vicious crossfire coming in there from 2 units of scouts from on high. Probably not the highest quality of arrows there, but considering the Corsair Blackguards to be enough of a threat to use all those arrows, there's plenty of them now dug into the dirt. I think it would be kind of cool if they didn't disappear after a while and they just stayed in place. Though I understand why they don't from a game memory perspective, but still, the battlefield would look a bit more atmospheric, I think, with loads of arrows dug into the ground at the base of defensive positions and walls. Don't exactly know what the purpose to this would be. 14 Corsair Blackguards essentially being thrown under the bus. I mean, I suppose the defenders will take every little bit of charity they can at this point in an attempt to try and get themselves back into proceedings with a reasonable chance at victory, but I don't know, they may have left it a little too late. Further back, Corsair infantry on the way forwards. So just throwing pretty much everything he has left at this point, Y2K, with his fellow attacking armies taking an eon to arrive. Certainly not the first time that has happened. At least this time it's not an established grace period at the start of a battle which is causing a large-scale delay. At least on this occasion it is a genuine decent amount of distance for the attackers to travel. Still, I do kind of appreciate the fact that Y2K wants to get things underway as quickly as possible, even if he doesn't really stand much of a chance of doing anything other than getting his own units killed. Corsair Blackguards, who recently, of course, we have seen be pretty effective as an infantry unit as well as at range. Very multifaceted unit indeed. We're very used to the Seafarers doing that, and the Corsair Blackguards very much the same sort of thing, though I guess because of Umbar's other heavy infantry options and also other range support options, whereas Numenor a little bit more limited in that regard. We see the Seafarers pretty much every time we see Numenor, whereas it's not a given that we'll see the Corsair Blackguards every time Umbar takes the field. Still, those 2 fences are back. You can see here though the assassins doing damage. That one dwarf went flying there in the face of that dagger. Some force that was flung with. So Erebor going to be moving in this way with what remains of Y2K's army by the look of it. The Easterlings coming from the other direction, and then Numenor, it remains to be seen. Numenor could swing right the way around and go from the 2 entrances that exist on that side of the settlement, though of course in so doing they may not be aware of it, but they will incur the wrath of the Bjornings and the other units of Black Riders, so we'll see if that turns out to be the case. These Corsair Blackguards don't seem to be doing or taking that much damage. The dwarves in no great rush to kill off these pirates. Very peculiar. Speaking of which though, their dwarven brethren have arrived. Erebor. There's also the bandits up here. Scouts firing away. I think they're trying to go after the Pharazim Swordmasters. I mean, I'm not sure it's going to be the most damaging archer fire that you've ever seen, but they're at least trying to soften up one of the most dangerous units of damage dealing infantry that the game has to offer. And is there really anything else to go after that's worth it? And I forgot the Templar Executioners are here as well for Numenor. 2 very high tier units indeed. In come the Corsair infantry, already shaken, though the Sons of Durin are also here. The Sons of Durin, of course, will be supremely effective against warriors of Khazad-dûm. There's also, however, the bandits. Will the bandits be able to make the difference here? I mean, Erebor getting things underway here before Numenor have swung around to the south, before the Easterlings are truly ready to attack from the north as well. So there's still this rather lopsided element to the attackers, though perhaps they feel as though they can get away with this purely because of the lead that they built up during their river crossing success. Bandits are in a good position actually, almost perfectly placed to do some good damage to the Sons of Durin here. That must be said as well, some attacking javelins, some Ironfoot axe throwers also, Blacklock engineers, so range damage also being sustained by the defensive line. And the defenders need domineering victories if they are to have much success here. Plenty of bandits. The Erebor bandits. And yeah, Numenor, they are going to be moving around to the south here, so I mean, Numenor are still fairly healthy, so I don't know if they're weak enough really to the point where a few units of cavalry would necessarily be enough to make the full difference that they may require. Over yonder, bandits. Again, the Eastlings look fairly healthy. I mean, that lead that they built up early on, the attackers, seems fairly unassailable. I mean, especially given the fact that when you consider what the neutrals are, they do have some units which are really pretty good, but much of them is a faction without focus. A lot of it is units that have simply been removed from the game at one point or another. Mercenary War Chief's another good example of that. Decent, but not exactly domineering. So it's all for them to do, really. That cavalry may be their only hope, and I highly doubt they're going to have enough left in the tank to completely destroy Numenor. The dwarves on the way forward as well, still with Erebor legionaries, Axe Guard of Erebor, axe throwers. Should be pretty effective against the vast majority of these neutrals units, who tend to be fairly lightly armoured, you have to say. The dwarves were heavily armoured, the Orthanc units heavily armoured as well, but much of the rest of it, you have old stuff from CARDOLAN and Erebor, you have lower quality orcs from Mordor, from way back in vanilla. Even the Morroquendi, not exactly the most heavily armoured units. That will only heighten the effectiveness of these throwing axes. Obsidian Guard moving forward as well is a bit of a concern. Mercenary War Chiefs already shaken. Of course, mercenary units well known for having that lower morale, and the War Chiefs are no exception to that. I believe this was also the unit used as the rebels general unit in Divide and Conquer. The ones that are just sort of hanging out. Wavering. Forward come the Blackwolds as well. Blackwolds are one unit that would be very welcome, I'm sure, for the defenders. Meanwhile, Black Riders moving in. The trap has been sprung. There's 2 units of Black Riders, as well as the unit of Bjornings. The Bjornings, being a larger unit, will have more of an impact off the charge, and we saw just how impactful that was in the last battle when the Shire, in spite of their infantry's failings on that occasion, the Bjornings certainly contributed to a very close battle on that occasion, and barrelling into the Royal Legion of Armenelos here, getting rather bullied here, the sword and board bodyguard of Numenor. Can't afford to stay in melee for too long though, especially not with Numenorian Shield Guard around. Numenorian cohort taking some damage. The Seafarers, which we've already mentioned by proxy when talking about the Corsair Blackguards, are here. Those javelins are exactly the sort of thing which could end up doing a lot of damage very quickly. The Bjornings, already only 12 of them remain as well, which is a concern for them. I mean, these more monstrous cavalry, almost berserkers on horseback, kind of similar to the war beasts of Harad. They definitely have that problem. The Black Riders individually are far more resilient, but the Bjornings were always going to be a little bit more of a quick damage dealer, and with them already gone, I have to say this cavalry ambush, while the idea was good, Numenor were just too prepared for it to be as effective maybe as the defenders needed it to be. Seafarers rumbling forwards. Black Riders in danger of getting kind of entangled here. They do manage to escape for now. Still doing their best to pick Numenor apart. I mean, Numenor have taken damage as a result of this. There's no doubt about that. And they will be a little bit less effective when trying to take the city, but there goes one of the enemy armies. So that's surely Y2K, his Corsair army, finally completely vanquished. Though the far more elite and professional forces he was fighting alongside should have enough to be able to sweep through the settlement. You know, still 3 units of Black Riders in all fairness. Kind of scary. If they can get into the settlements, of course, they can then try and block off the entrance they came through, and then the Black Riders become less effective, but still. Meanwhile, Rhun in the north now getting their assault underway as well. Once again, Warriors of Khazad-dûm and Morroquendi pikes are the ones that are forming up this initial front line, with the Scion Rim trying to burrow through the front line, making it all about an up-close and personal engagement, trying to take away the effectiveness of the Pikes Phalanx formation. Though the Dwarves digging their heels in, making it a little bit more difficult to do so, though the numbers advantage they still have is a bit too substantial, I think. Bandits, however, their support could be absolutely priceless. Morroquendi bows are here. The Dwarves starting to make inroads, though not without cost to themselves. Hopefully my voice holds together. This is the last recording I'm doing before taking a fairly lengthy trip away for work, so this is the only one I need it to hold together for now. Mercenary War Chiefs. I mean, they will do a little bit of extra damage given their two-handed swords, but Highborns of Erebor should surely have too much for them in melee, though maybe the damage done by the Javelins and all of the range support that was in a really good position, maybe it will turn out to be too much, and there are also Drake Broodlings in behind, so these sort of more shock-based units, the Black Riders also on the way over from Adexa as well, Blacklock Engineers guarding the rear with the Dragon Slayers of Ered Mithrin. Drake Broodlings don't want to remain in sustained melee with them if they can help it, but if they can keep moving over them, could be very, very effective indeed. They're in. Axguard of Erebor still doing their level best to get rid of what remains of this defensive line. Some scouts, 250 archers in a single unit is obviously pretty substantial, while the individual arrows may not be of the highest quality. There's a lot of volume going down range very quickly. That could be important. Don't know how much ammunition they have either. That's another stat which may very well have changed in the time between vanilla and now. Almost certainly will have changed between vanilla and now. Vanilla was a long time ago at this point. Meanwhile, Drake Broodlings all up in everyone's business now. Friendly bows. Silver Riders of Orthanc as well, another unit of cavalry. Now the Numenorians, they very much condensed their own army at this point. I mean, the spears can guard their rear. Surely on the front line as well, with stuff like Pharazim Swordmasters. It says defeat seems certain, though I find that kind of hard to believe with Pharazim Swordmasters, with... they have Temple Executioners still alive? Maybe that cavalry did more damage than I was initially thinking, if this is all Numenor have left. And there goes the Dwarven General as well, so all of a sudden, for reasons that are a little bit nebulous, the attackers do appear to be losing steam. We are marching towards the final 10,000 frames as well. Most curious. Could it be? I mean, these Black Riders, as the battle gets more and more bit part and all of the units get significantly weaker, if Black Riders are still alive and they still have the opportunity to charge into things, they could be huge difference makers. And you have to say, actually, it's not looking particularly good for the attackers over here. It says victory seems certain for the Erebor Dwarves, but Morokwendi bows getting some crossfire into them. There's not that many of them left. I thought they were going to have a fairly domineering victory thanks to their bodyguard units over here, but it wasn't the case, and maybe the Eriador bandits were an absolutely vital part of stunting their attack. Can't underestimate javelins, even lower tier ones. Though surely, see here the Nar Rim absolutely painting that wall with fire. Spears of Orthanc and Morokwendi bows. There's also Carmel Shadow Bow, so not allowing here the defenders to get into a particularly good position with their support units without giving them a taste of some counterfire, and maybe that is why Rhun are still looking a little bit healthier by comparison, though maybe a little bit less of a focus has also been placed on this defensive position up here. The Ents still very much trying to smash their way through individual parts of the Easterling force. Riders of Orthanc oof. Yeah, they're doing a better job here, I think, the Easterlings, with their own supporting units, stuff like the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen moving forward, but also the Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen scything their way through the Riders of Orthanc, who are here in hopes of trying to maybe put the kind of pressure to Rhun that they put on Erebor at the main entrance to the settlement. I say main entrance, the one facing the river. There isn't really a clear entrance to this outpost that you would say is the main one. And again, Numenor's general does fall. A unit of Numenorian Shield Guard is needed on the front line now. It is now non-negotiable. The extra punch of the Blackwolds enough to get the job done over here. I still don't know whether or not the defenders are going to have what it takes to do this to all of the attacking positions. I think with how well the Easterlings are doing with their own ranged units makes it a little bit less likely. Yeah. Further back over here, Spears of Emenduir. I mean, Erebor, they're still alive, technically speaking. They've managed to push some units over here. Some Erebor legionaries, only 12 of them, against still significantly over 200 scouts. The difference in quality individually is still huge, but I don't know. 45 Erebor legionaries moving forward. I mean, if they are victorious here, Erebor, it will be to a far lesser extent than I was initially thinking, though any sort of victory at this point for the attackers would be the sort of thing they would take, just to allow them to get some sort of domino effect going, maybe go to support Rhun, and at that point you would think the attackers should still then have enough to be victorious overall. Morokwendi bows firing at point blank. The scouts ballooning their shots high, doing their best. One Ent remains, getting into the backfield. Unsurprisingly, going after the Eastron crossbowmen. Actually, no, going after the Nar Rim, which is a little bit weird, but just trying to kill off what they can. Black Riders still over here. Those Carmel Shadow Bows have been getting into. I've been getting some good shots off in a good position here. Riders of Orthanc still alive, so the Dragon's Wrath crossbow is not able to finish them off completely, though. Body piercing crossbows, based on how important angle of fire is, they are a little bit more difficult to use than rangers, though extremely devastating, and we saw why. Each shot scythed through several of those heavily armoured mounted crossbows, which could have been so dangerous had they been allowed to continue. Still arrow fire being traded back and forth. Plenty of Morokwendi bows still one of the central elements to this defence. Scouts fighting in melee against, well, very little remains of Erebor actually, just Blacklock Engineers routing. Highborns of Erebor, only 7 of them remain, yet still victory still seems certain against a huge amount of scouts. Dragon Slayers also doing the same against Morokwendi bows. Scouts firing away at what, though? 9-foot warriors that are already running away. Need to be making better use of their ammunition, but still a healthy amount of black bolts over here. Scouts victorious against what remained of Erebor there. Some of the neutral troll short axe throwers. And rear-charging from the Black Riders after those spears needed to be committed to the front line to keep it going. And Numenor have also completely collapsed really as well. So Numenor gone. Erebor very scattered. Still present, but very scattered. So the attackers' hopes... excuse me. I think I might be getting a cold as well. That's unfortunate. What looked so promising for the attackers going into this is now looking like so much of what they will need to do is going to be placed upon Rhun's shoulders. And how broad are they? A real firing squad has been set up as well, and 2 units of Spears of Orthanc, 1 unit of Riders, a couple of units of poison projectile arrows, and even Rhun I think are really actually going to end up struggling. What started off looking pretty grim for the defenders has actually ended up working out very well, and I think a huge part of that has got to be their ranged support units. Those crossbows, those Morriquendi bows, troll short axe throwers have been here and there. And also a special mention has to go to the Black Riders as well, which with 3 units of them in conjunction with those Bjornings, they were actually able to do critical damage to Numenor as they tried to put pressure on the south side of the settlement. And that was the big difference maker in the end. I say was. Still every chance that Rhun could pull this out of the bag, I suppose, but far less clear than it once was. Eastrons. Got the, I mean, they clearly see the danger that was the Black Riders. The Black Riders obviously did get in and amongst things and did a lot of damage to those Carmel shadow bows as well. Problem is, they may run into the same problem as Numenor, where their rear guard unit here. Although, to be fair, I'm not entirely sure what the Black Riders were hoping to accomplish with that, with a kamikaze charge right into a braced unit of halberds, but the problem may arise eventually where these units of halberds are needed on the front line to prevent some sort of Easterling collapse. As they continue to move, Morriquendi bows being called into service once again as melee units. They did reasonably well in a hopeless fight earlier on against Numenor on the riverside. Over yonder, I mean, they are struggling a little bit more so here again because of the presence of something like Carmel's Chosen, though crossbow bolts also finding their way further down here. What is occurring with the dwarven units there? Doesn't seem to be much of the dwarves left, if anything. I think Erebor in fact may be gone completely. There's 3 Numenorian cohorts still standing over here. And then there is 1 Erebor legionary, so I mean technically I suppose both Numenor and Erebor still have their presence on the field, though by the same token not really, and also they see him coming. He's going to have to wade through crossbow fire. He's going to try and pad his kill count with Orc Fodder. Orc Fodder just going to retreat past him with each swing of that axe. An extra kill against the fodder. Yeah, Rhun, I mean, against Spears of Orthanc, I really don't think Rhun have got what it takes anymore. Those Spears of Orthanc are going to be too strong in melee. There is still the matter of, I think this is the 1 Black Rider that does remain, but still, any extra kill they get on these strong crossbows. Oh no, there's 3 Black Riders. All the Gamperin being thrown forwards, I think more of a Hail Mary, to be honest, to try and put some extra pressure on the infantry, maybe try and get some momentum going through the streets of the town, but it isn't going to be enough in the long run, really. Unfortunately for the attackers, what began with such promise, in the end, the the garbage bin of units of a faction, which is the neutrals, have proven themselves to be fairly effective, I suppose, in a weird kind of way. I suppose you have everything you need in the neutrals, because there's kind of one of every kind of unit. Whether they're actually appropriately balanced for this version of the game, both in an overpowered or underpowered kind of way, is questionable, but yeah, definitely a weird one. Definitely a weird one. Spears up here on the bank. See, the Spears of Orthanc are a unit we see actually fairly often, because we see this version of the game's version of Dunland a fair amount. And the Spears and Riders of Orthanc are the only unique things about that faction. Not too dissimilar to the neutrals, actually, only slightly less of a complete mess of units amongst them. There's no elves, there's no dwarves, obviously. No removed mercenary units. Instead, it's more of just a mess of the Dunland units from Isengard, several units from Rudour. Again, that's something else that the new patch will do nicely, with Dunland being far more their own entity now. Spears of Avonweir on the way forwards, Blackwolds as well. Scouts continuing to shoot volley after volley in here now. Surround is officially complete. Actually, I think, to be fair, we could probably go up to ×2 speed from here. This is it. Dragon's Wrath crossbows will probably be the last unit left standing, given how many of them there are left and given how competent they are as a melee fighter. Although Carmel's chosen decent enough as well, as the scouts run away. The Gamprim holding back a horde of Blackwolds. I mean, with the kind of quality that Rhun still have, if things were a little bit closer, maybe they could have lent on that to give them a chance at winning in the long run, but I think the situation is too far gone, unfortunately, for them. And would come the scouts, already shaken. They have definitely shown themselves to be low tier, even with old stat blocks. They rout easily. They look like they're going to lose to 7 individual bodyguards when they're still largely at full health. Exactly the sort of thing you'd expect to see from the lowliest of Mordor archers that there has ever been. Many players admitting defeat now. Cole, the only one left standing. And surely that is going to be that. The Trollshore X-Throwers start to flee as well. Defeat seems certain. There goes the Easterling General at long last. I mean, having a look here, yeah, in the end, about 6% the difference in favour of the defenders, so the fight for the settlement really was pretty domineering for them. I mean, I suppose, just as a cursory glance, general after general falling now. No, that's not really enough in terms of kills. There's a fair amount of dead Easterlings there, but that's not really enough in terms of kills of ranged units being achieved on that bridge to make a difference. A huge difference in the long run anyway. It's the sort of thing you'd expect as attackers moving across a defensive position like that, even at the best of times. So I was wondering if maybe that kill count was a little bit more substantial than I initially gave it credit for, but nothing too out of the ordinary there. And ultimately I do think the attackers still, in that initial phase of the battle, still comprehensively won the river crossing fight. So it really was the good work that the defenders did in and around the outpost itself, to my eye, which was the reason they have gone on to recover and ultimately win this battle. What is still here? What is at the midst of all this? Ah, one Carmel's chosen, well, 2 of them technically, so they managed to outlast the crossbows, which I guess as a dedicated infantry unit you can't be too surprised about that. But there we have it. Kind of a weird battle on a very familiar map, but with a very unfamiliar setup, I suppose you would call it. And yeah. So yeah, big thank you once again to Tommy the Unwise, who has once again sent another one of these battles. Been pretty much he's definitely sent the most amount of battles to me so far this year, and been one of the main supporters of the channel, and definitely one of the main reasons why I've had so much content to do, even in spite of the fact that, you know, with the new patch on the way, people are definitely looking forwards more towards that. So many of the people that were sort of sending me replays in 2022 are obviously looking a little bit more towards that, and some of the custom scenario creators and map creators are also looking a little bit more at that these days. So keeping the channel going while that's going on was always going to be a little bit of a concern, but fortunately that hasn't proven to be too much of a problem so far. And I think, to be fair, with how far I've recorded in advance at this point, I should be just fine for when the new patch comes out, especially if this sort of thing continues in the interim. So yeah, all is looking good, and thank you to Tommy for that. Big thanks to all the other players as well for being a part of this one. Definitely rather unorthodox. Like I said, familiar map. We've seen the CARDOLAN outpost quite a lot at this point. It's kind of falling into that same category now as like Bursagath and Thranduil's Halls, where we've seen it so much that it might be time to take a little bit of a hiatus from it, especially given that this was kind of a weird and wacky variant of it. So it might be a good place to try and give it a bit of a cool down, if anything. But yeah, we'll see. No need to make any sort of decision on that right now. As for what the attackers could have done differently, I'm not really sure. I think it's really just a case of some well-executed cavalry ambush and good use of the ranged units. Other than that, I think it really was just the way the battle went. It was always going to be kind of chaotic, and trying to be super organised about it was going to be a little bit more difficult given the weird nature of the defenders on this occasion. But yeah, I think the defenders are fully deserving of their victory here. Let's see what did the damage for the neutrals. The Orthanc units unsurprisingly doing quite well, obviously very solid in melee, both on foot and on horseback. But the main source of damage is of course going to come from their armour-piercing crossbow bolts. The Black Riders, I think we're going to be seeing a lot of kills from them. Just their longevity is the thing. Like many cavalry units, the main problem you have with single HP cavalry units is so many of them die exiting a charge every time you use them. That's not going to be a problem with the Black Riders, who've got hit points on top of hit points. They're obviously not the best at doing damage quickly, but much like the Nazgul on foot, they do have a tendency to rack up an impressive kill count over a longer period of time. But we of course see the Black Riders a little bit less because of their sequestered away nature in this faction that is seldom seen. The Morroquendi bows were also very impressive at range, and also reasonably solid in melee considering the kind of foes they were having to go up against. Morroquendi pikes, just there to hold the line really. They did okay, though maybe not as well as you could expect them to do. Warriors of Khazad actually fairly disappointing, but again, considering Numenor, armour piercing from Rhun, Erebor with their quality, it was never going to be an easy fight for them, so you've got to give them some sort of credit there. Blackwold's doing okay. Scouts, 104 kills from Scouts is not too bad. The rest pretty much as you would expect. Of course, our Archer's actually doing a decent job here for Medex's army, although much of these kills would have been on another very numbers-heavy Corsair army, so this is probably the one defending army where we've got to take into account the lower quality nature of what many of these kills were likely against. But plenty of kills for the Corsair Archers. The Pike's also doing decently, but the rest, other than the unit of Black Riders, of course, which was a part of that kind of evil Rohirrim that we saw at the end. Yeah, definitely the important one there. Spears of Orthanc for T.S. Niehoff, plenty of units breaking 100 kills, as you would expect. Bjorning's 103 is okay, given that they were only there for a small amount of time. It does go to show their ability to deal damage more quickly than the Black Riders, I suppose, but a little bit more longevity would have really helped hammer that home. Morroquendi Pike's doing a little bit better. Bandits doing okay. The Ents as well, not too bad at all. And finally, Hidden's army, fewer units actually breaking the 100 kills barrier, though it looks like a bigger army in general. Trollshaws, again the Black Riders, unsurprisingly, definitely the MVPs for the defenders here in that later period. Tommy's unit of Black Riders definitely got bullied a little bit more, but then that was kind of by design with them being committed early. The other units, however, saved for later, and they were very effective. Spears of Orthanc doing nicely as well. Hex throwers, yeah, pretty much as you would expect. So yeah, big thank you to all the players for this one. Interesting to see the neutrals. It's something definitely a little bit different. As for what's going to be coming up next, the very next battle to come out will be a reenactment of the Battle of the Five Armies. So that was sent to me by, not by Tommy, by someone else whose name completely escapes me at this point. But yes, that will be the next battle to come out. There's a few others as well that I have got in the backlog for Reforged. I think I've got like 4 actually, including that Battle of the Five Armies one for Reforged, so effectively enough for 2 more weeks worth of content just of Reforged. Got a couple of battles as well in Silmarillion, so we can ratchet that up to 3, and hopefully by the time this one comes out we should be into like mid-May, with an extra 3 weeks taking us into early June. It would be my great hope that by then we would be discussing like the release of the new patch, but we'll see. We will see. Of course, in the interim, if anything else does get sent to me in this patch, it will still be shown, so do please send it, especially considering the fact that there's no guarantee that that sort of time period will see the release of the new patch anyway. Yeah, and also with my work schedule undoubtedly going to be absolutely horrendous going forward, it is going to be a little bit of a fight to keep everything running as it is, but I'm sure that we will manage somehow. So yeah, big thank you to all the players once again. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.